found two school districts less than an hour apart, one on the north side of Chicago, one on the south side, and one spends 3 times as much money as the other. The best way to understand this really is think about school funding as 3 buckets. Okay, the first and the smallest bucket comes from the federal government. That's about 10% of the money schools have to spend. The other two come from some balance between state dollars and local dollars. And this big imbalance really comes from that local bucket because much of that money is raised through local property taxes. And it makes sense. If you live in a property wealthy district, it's going to be easier for you to raise more money and spend more money in your schools than it is for a property poor district.
Give us some more examples of the kinds of stories that you have been hearing from fellow reporters on this project.
Sure, yeah, I want to make clear, I mentioned Chicago there. This isn't just a big city, large district problem. One story specifically comes to mind out of rural Sumter County, Alabama, which is farm and timberland in the western part of the state. The school district there is largely African American and low income, and our reporter there, Dan Carson from WBHM, he visited Livingston Junior High. He got a tour from the principal, and it was clear to him almost from the moment he set foot in the building that this district just doesn't have the money that it needs. Here he is visiting a former classroom. Emphasis on former.
Yeah, you can smell the mold in here. It floods when it rains in here? Oh, the floor's open.
It floods, but you can tell there's a steady leak that comes down.
Oh, this is attached to water?
And the principal told him a second later that, he'd love to be able to use this room for something else. He just can't because it's in such bad shape.
Well, Corey, as I mentioned in the introduction, more than a dozen states are now in the middle of school funding lawsuits. Who is suing and what are their complaints?
Generally, the who is parents, activists, and in many cases, local low-income school districts. What are they suing about? I think the best way to explain that is to go back to one of the landmark school funding lawsuits. It was 1973 out of Texas, and it went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was filed by a father outside San Antonio named Demetrio Rodriguez, and he was angry because he could see in a district just next door many more resources. And he argued, look, there's no way that my kids going to a decrepit school where many of the teachers aren't even certified are getting the same education that those kids over there in this other district are getting. Here's his lawyer, Arthur Gotchman, making that argument before the Supreme Court.
Are we going to have 2 classes of citizens, minimum opportunity citizens and first-class citizens?
Ultimately, the court ruled against Rodriguez. It was a narrow ruling, 5-4, but they said, look, there's no protection in the U.S. Constitution for equal education funding.
So Demetrio Rodriguez lost. That was more than 40 years ago. Corey, are you saying that schools have no remedies in the courts?
No, the interesting thing about this case is that even though Rodriguez lost, it was a turning point in the school funding lawsuit movement. And so that plaintiffs shifted their attention away from the U.S. Constitution and towards very specific language in most state constitutions. To the point that we are today where some 45 states have now seen school funding lawsuits.
What does all this mean at the school level, right down to the student level?
Yeah, a big part of this project is hearing the personal stories of students, teachers, parents, and administrators in these districts, both big city and small rural. They're having to make tough choices because they don't have the money that they think they need. And we have one story from a rural district outside of Phoenix that, cut its arts teachers, cut their librarians, and